joining us now is economist Dean Baker. He is the co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. His areas of research include labor and macroeconomics, intellectual property, social security, Medicare, European labor markets. He has been on the program before. He is the author of Getting Back to Full Employment, A Better Bargain for Working People, The End of Loser Liberalism, one of my more favorite titles, Making Markets Progressive is the subtitle of that one, and a number of other books. And he joins us now to talk Donald Trump. Dean, thanks for coming on the program, as always.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Well, I was really interested by the piece you did a couple days ago, I think it was, several days ago now. We had a milestone, and I forgot to light a candle, which was Donald Trump passed his threshold, giving him a lock on the Republican Party nomination. And there's a lot of talk about how Trump is the creature of a kind of an ugly nativist strain in the white American culture and so on. And not without merit, I would say, some of those arguments. But your piece was entitled "The Elites and the Rise of Donald Trump," and I wanted to talk about that too. What's the role that power elites played in this country, you think, in terms of the Donald Trump phenomenon?
Well, the story that I'm trying to tell here is that, clearly, as you mentioned, Trump is saying a lot of racist, nativist, sexist comments that, rightly offend, an awful lot of people. But the fact is that the people who support him, they weren't supporting Donald Trump 20 years ago. And my argument is that, they are responding to what they perceive as bad conditions. And the fact is, most people in this country have not benefited from the economic growth of the last 4 decades. And when I'm saying the elites are responsible here, it's because of policies that they designed. So on the one hand, they're designing policies that have the effect of redistributing income upwards, and that's why these people aren't benefiting. Then these people turn around and they hear a demagogue like Trump saying, "Oh, it's all the fault of the Mexicans and Chinese, and I'm going to beat them up." Well, obviously they have some disposition to these sentiments, or that wouldn't sound appealing to them. But on the other hand, if they saw some other path, if this didn't correspond to their reality that they were losing, then they probably wouldn't be looking that way. So it's a little, to my view, hypocritical to have elites, tut-tutting like, "Oh, look at those stupid racists," when what's made these people act on those views, willing to support a demagogue like Trump, is that they really are losing. That's the reality, and the elites were the ones that put those policies in place.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I wanted to talk to you about this issue, there's a sensitivity in talking about it, understandably and rightfully, which I thought, by the way, you handled very well in this piece, which is available on the Huffington Post and elsewhere, which is obviously in no way, is it condoning, or does one want to condone the racism and the ugly sentiments and the outbursts of violence by Trump supporters and so on. But on the other hand, it's almost as if, and I don't know that this is conscious, but it's almost as if the ugliness of his supporters is sometimes used as an excuse for not discussing what might be some underlying causes for the rise of this phenomenon, if you know what I'm driving at. In other words, it seems to me that people get very surprised at phenomena that are utterly predictable, which is that if you have an ethnic majority in a country that is deprived of economic opportunity, that sees its security and livelihood, in their perception, eroding or rotting away around them, that they may lash out in ways that disgust us and that we rightly loathe, but that shouldn't preclude us from talking about the underlying conditions that gave rise to that in the first place. And I think that's a conversation we need to be having. That's why I welcomed your piece. So what are some of those underlying phenomena? I mean, I have my own theories, but is it that basically just that we're not sharing anymore, working people aren't sharing in the economic growth that they once did?
Well, that's the basic story. So, again, there's a well-known story that we could look back over, what we often refer to as the golden age, the 3 decades following World War II, where we had very rapid economic growth, and it was widely shared, so that, people up and down the income distribution, in fact, people towards the bottom got more, or larger share of the gains. than people at the top. But in any case, we had very strong growth, very strong productivity growth, and workers got the benefit of that. So wages are rising, real terms, 2% a year or thereabout. After, we get into some problems in the 70s, the economy slows, but really the story of distribution, the change in distribution, is an 80s story. That's when you start to see gains in growth and productivity, and it all goes to those at the high end. And, the argument that I'm making is that that wasn't just an accident. So, a set of policies, this begins with Reagan. Reagan's not the only villain here, but it begins with Reagan. Some of the things are obvious. Reagan, of course, very anti-union. We have a number of anti-union policies. We've seen unionization rates plummet, particularly in the private sector, from over 20% back in 1980 to 6 to 7% today. That certainly has weakened the power of workers, working people. On top of that, one of the issues, this is going to come up next week, the Federal Reserve Board might be raising interest rates as early, I guess, the week after next. And the reason they do that is they're worried, they're worried that there's too many jobs. Workers are getting more power, and they're going to push up wages, and that will cause inflation. You keep workers from getting wage gains, that's bad news for workers. So those are two of the policies. Our trade policy, this is something that certainly Trump and in fact Bernie Sanders has also talked about. Our trade policy has no doubt hurt a lot of working people, and this is something most economists now recognize. They resisted it for the longest time, but there's now pretty solid evidence, pretty indisputable, that a large segment of the workforce have been hurt by the patterns of trade over the last 3 decades, particularly the large trade deficits we've been running in the last 15 years or so. Again, this was by design. We didn't have to run large trade deficits. And also, I make the point, what we do trade, the fact that we trade manufacturing goods, that's unnatural. We could have designed our trade pacts to, put our doctors in competition, our lawyers in competition with people in the developing world. Plenty of very smart, ambitious people in India and China and other countries who could train to our standards work here at a fraction of the pay as our doctors and lawyers, and it has the exact same benefit as getting manufactured goods from China from people working for $1 an hour. Same story, exact same story. You use the same graph, just change the name of the axes. So these and other policies that I mentioned in the piece and I've been writing about for years, these redistributed income upward. And, as a result of that, most workers, have seen very little gain. They feel they feel a lot of insecurity in their life with, again, we could document this. We know the cause of that, and then for our elites to be tut-tutting them, they do have real complaints. And, again, Trump, I'm not saying Trump's got the answers here, but, it's understandable they're going to look to someone who at least claims to have answers.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and first of all, we could get into how the elites make excuses for conditions as they exist, and there are whole schools of argument that no, it's impossible to reverse the trends created by these trade deals, which I think you would probably agree that's not true. These trade deals, as they're currently constructed, were not inevitable. They're not the product of inevitable forces. They can be reversed or altered. But I would argue that the failure of elites on particularly the more liberal side of the elite spectrum is that nobody has offered a challenge. Nobody has offered a unifying narrative, the way, in a sense, you just did, in the political process, so that people who see, and we should also stipulate, obviously, the growth of post-World War II growth, there were people who were excluded from that. There was racial exclusion, there were regional exclusion, and so on. But by and large, there was much more prosperity, much more shared prosperity, that when people see that going away, and what's supposed to be the liberal side of the spectrum, the side that represents them, offers no narrative, no explanation for what's happening to you, and no potential solution, that it opens the way for a demagogue to come in and say it's those Muslims, it's those Latinos, it's whatever it is, plus a sort of smattering of things that may have some truth to them, like the trade deals. And then in a sense, Trump is also represents a failure of the elites because nobody was really giving that narrative. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And one of the points that should really drive this home, we see the rise of right-wing nationalists all across the West. You see it in
Yes.
in France. With Le Pen being a major actor now. I mean, I don't think she'll end up as president of France, but clearly they're big actors there. You see it even in Scandinavian countries. They have right-wing populist parties. In Greece, an openly neo-fascist party, New Dawn, gets 7, 8, 9% of the vote. So you're seeing this everywhere, and to say that people just became irrationally hating of immigrants or something. I mean that's just silly. I mean people don't those hatreds were there. It's not as though that they just appeared, but the fact that people are prepared to go out there and actually support candidates who say we're going to beat up immigrants, that's something that's new, and that's happening at the same time in all these different places. It should sort of say, well, there is some underlying force that's causing that to happen.
Right, and we're talking with the economist Dean Baker, and in a sense, that's what I meant by the utter predictability of all this. It's almost as if the national conversation, the pundit conversation, is not driven by experience or empirical data. I mean, you also have, I know the Trump-Hitler comparisons may be overblown, but you have the rise of national the Nazi movement in Germany. You have Huey Long in Louisiana when it had economic problems. I mean, it's not. It strikes me as something all but inevitable under conditions like this. So I guess that raises the question, well, how do you counter it? I mean, I suppose one answer is with the Bernie Sanders narrative, the Elizabeth Warren narrative, the system is rigged, it's rigged against you. Is that basically the gist of the argument people need to be making to stop the rise of Trump or whoever follows him?
Well, I think so. I mean, and I have tremendous admiration for both, Senator Sanders and Senator Warren. They've done a great deal. But I would actually argue, I do think you have to go further. I'm not blaming them for not laying out a full narrative. They have their hands full. But, I think we do have to, press even further along those lines, because I think it has to be very clear to people. Because I worry sometimes people will hear, Senator Warren speak up and, they go, oh, yeah, people are being ripped off with payday loans. Well, they are,
right.
But that's just a really small part of the picture, and so I think to sort of say, no, look, this is systematic. I started by mentioning the Fed just because, to my view, nothing's bigger, no single factor is bigger, and it's just so clear. Here you have these people with, prepared to slam on the brakes because they think the economy has too many jobs. And,
right.
I'm saying exactly what they're doing. Now, they, of course, will give, if we had someone, and I respect Janet Yellen. She's a very good economist. I don't think she's a bad person or anything. She'd say, we're worried about inflation, and inflation could be really bad, this and that. And, I understand inflation. And, I would simply say, yeah, there is a non-zero risk of inflation. But you just go, look, we know we're going to be keeping people from getting jobs, and that's really bad for those people. And because we have a weaker labor market, we're keeping, maybe 10 or 20 times as many people from seeing pay raises. And that's really bad for those people. And, I would just assign a different weight to that. I'd go, look, we know we're really doing bad things to a lot of people who are going to be hurt by this because, and then I take the other side, the inflation. Yeah, we could have inflation. And, inflation is, if the inflation rate rises a 0.5 percentage point, 1 percentage point, to my view, that's almost nothing. If we got German-style hyperinflation, sure, that's a big deal. But there's no simple way getting from here to there. That is a long, long process that we're nowhere even beginning. So, it's just, we have these people and they're very visible, and they're making a decision that, it's very harmful to large segments of the U.S. workforce. And it just doesn't get the attention it deserves. I think if people knew more about it, they would be up in arms.
Yeah, and I think just to close on the Federal Reserve issue, and to close with the Federal Reserve issue, I guess you use the brakes and accelerator analogy, which I think is a great one. It's almost I feel like, from my point of view, like I'm in a cab. It was going 5 miles an hour. Now it's going 10 or 15. But and I'm saying, why do you want to put on the brakes? And they're saying, to me, the explanation seems to be, well, we're accelerating and we might be going 90 in a few years. Well, that's not the time to put on the brakes. And that they also say, and we want to send a message that the brakes still work. Or so I don't even fully get it, but it almost seems to be like psychological, like chess playing, or ritualized behavior. I don't get it. I'm sorry, Dean. I just don't get
Yeah,
what they're
well,
doing.
I'm pretty much with you on that. It's, and again, I've been in a lot of discussions with these people, and I literally don't see any argument that comes close to making sense on the other side. And I'm anxious to hear it, because I don't want to just say that, I think they're stupid. And I don't think they're stupid. They're very knowledgeable
Right.
people. But it just, you go, how does it make sense to say, we have to raise interest rates because we're worried that, inflation can get out of control, when we're so far below any story of inflation being a problem, which doesn't, again, a year from now, maybe we really will be looking at data and they'd have a good case. But today, it's very hard to see.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but I sure hope they don't do it this month. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah.
But we will find out. And economist Dean Baker, as always, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Richard.